Well, thank you everyone for joining us today. My name is Rahul Patel, and I will be leading or moderating the STEM talk session for today at the seventh Polygen Symposium of Rising Scholars. The goal of the symposium is to celebrate and showcase the hard work of our Polygen scholars, all of whom have worked tirelessly on their projects over the last couple of months. We have about 4 students presenting their work today on a variety of topics ranging from AI to biology. And a fellow member of the Polygen's team will be scoring each of the students' presentations, which will help us determine the prize and the winners, prize winners after the event. Please go ahead and type your questions in the Q&A if you have any questions for each of the speakers. We'll have time at the end of the session for all the speakers to answer your questions. Like I said, we have 3 students today, or in the chat right now, or 4 total. Anya Lal, Aviraj, Dastidar, Abhinav, and Jasmine, and they'll be presenting in that order today. So I'll go ahead and pass the torch to Anya to begin the presentation, and I ask that everyone has their videos off outside of the presenter during their presentation, as well as their mics. So, yeah.
All right, let me share my screen really quickly. Okay, can everyone see the presentation right?
Yep.
All right, perfect. I'm going to begin right now. Good morning, everyone. My name is Anya Lal. I am a senior at Milpitas High School, and my presentation is on the gut-brain axis and its connection to mental health. So, are you really what you eat? So the research question is, how does an altered diet improve the management of neurological disorders and mental health? And we're going to answer a context question on how the gut microbiome interacts with the brain through the gut-brain axis. An overview of contents is we're going to start with the brain to gut connection, how the brain regulates the gut to brain connection, how the gut can talk back to the brain, the gut-brain crosstalk, so what happens if either one is impacted, how does diet affect mental health? So I'm going to be comparing 2 different diets and how they affect the gut and then how they affect the mental state. And then we're going to end with discussion and any future questions. So let's start with the brain-gut connection. So the part of the nervous system today that we're going to be focusing on is the autonomic nervous system, which is a subset of the nervous system that controls involuntary actions just like digestion. There are 3 components. The first one is sympathetic, which deals with arousal and fear. The parasympathetic, which deals with calmness and any regular body functions. And then the enteric, which is a very interesting part of the nervous system because it allows for independent digestion in the gut. And it can regulate without the brain telling anything to do it. And then also it contributes to the gut musculature and responds directly to the brain. It covers the entire digestive system. And in the parasympathetic nervous system, the normal bodily functions one, we have the vagus nerve. And if the enteric nervous system ever needs to signal anything to the brain, if something's going wrong, if it's regulating something, it can do so through this vagus nerve that is the main nerve for a gut-brain communication. And 10% of this vagus nerve communication is efferent. So the brain will tell the gut what to do through the vagus nerve, and that's 10% of the vagus nerve's functions. Moving on to the gut-brain connection. A fun fact is that the gut produces 80% of serotonin, and we're going to get back into that later. So the gut microbiome is a collection of bacteria in the digestive tract, and you can acquire this bacteria through your diet, and it kind of affects the way your gut works. So the gut sends back information to the vagus nerve and the enteric nervous system. And the unique part is that the gut can also send back things to regulate the brain, which has been recently researched. Let's go into the HPA axis, which is the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis. This is a pathway in the nervous and endocrine system. And the endocrine system deals with hormones, and the nervous system is obviously your brain. and this helps regulate body stability. Also, the immune system can get developed by the gut. It secretes a protein called cytokines, and that affects immune cells in the brain. There's so many things about the gut. The gut also helps strengthen the blood-brain barrier, which is this really semi-permeable barrier between blood vessels and tissues and the brain. So any bad chemicals will be warded off by this blood-brain barrier, and the gut can help strengthen that. Let's go back to our serotonin fact. Serotonin is a neurotransmitter, which is a chemical messenger for brain signals. Serotonin regulates mood, so happiness. So whenever you think of the word serotonin boost, you think of things that make you happy. And the gut produces 80% of that happy chemical. So a happy gut is a happy mind. And at the very end is short chain fatty acids, which are metabolites that help with communication between the gut and the brain. Let's go into crosstalks. So let's start with stress. So a healthier gut can help with better stress management. In an experiment, mice were compared with a healthy gut and an impaired gut. And the people with healthy gut had a higher development of their HPA axis, which means less stress. Furthermore, in depression, a sad gut is a sad brain. In another experiment based on mice, one group of mice had induced depression, and then through a fecal microbiota transplant where their feces are transferred into another mouse, which was healthy, that healthy mouse also started showing depressive tendencies because their gut got altered. So a sad gut is a sad brain. All right, for Alzheimer's, a bad gut is a bad memory. So in a study of patients, not mice, with Alzheimer's, there was less diversity of bacteria in the gut and more pathogenic bacteria associated with inflaming the brain, which is never good news. Autism spectrum disorder. There's always been a history of people with autism spectrum disorders having digestive problems like constipation. And now we know that less diverse bacteria is in the gut for people with autism spectrum disorders, and there's less short chain fatty acids. So their gut-brain communication is altered. In Parkinson's, they have a higher intestinal permeability, which means there's a larger chance of bad things making it into the digestive system. So these mice getting bacteria from Parkinson's patients, which is again another mice experiment, they also started to have movement problems and neuroinflammation, showing that the gut bacteria is a big impact on Parkinson's. All right, let's move on. Here's some references. And let's move on to the real question here. What about diet? Does a specific diet contribute to better gut health? And does that diet impact our mental health then? Let's start with one diet that I'm going to be comparing, which is the Mediterranean diet. It is a very infamous diet and known for being healthy. What is it? So there's veggies, fruits, legumes, and unprocessed grains, very healthy foods. And there's less meat intake, especially red meat. And dairy comes in the form of fermented foods. And then there's less sweets and less sodium. How does this influence the gut? So there's more short chain fatty acids, means more communication between the gut and the brain, good regulation. More fiber digesting bacteria, so you probably have a less chance of getting constipation. And less harmful E. coli, and there's a higher diversity of bacteria in the gut, which is great news. Here's a picture in real time, looks very healthy. Let's go on to the Western diet. So what is the Western diet? A lot of people are talking bad about this. Let's see why. There's snacking, processed foods, animal fats like red meat, and low fiber foods. And there's a lot of simple carbs, saturated fats, emulsifiers, things that are known to harm the gut. So how does that influence the gut in real time? It harms the bacteria in the gut. You don't want a less diverse gut. Now your gut is less healthy. There's bad intestinal permeability, which means, again, going back to the Parkinson's slide, that means that there's more potential chemicals getting into your body. It also leaks toxic metabolites into the bloodstream, which is not great, and inflammatory cytokines, which means your immune system also gets compromised. Here's a picture of the Western diet in real time. I'm sure it's very familiar. Let's go into diet and mental health. The Mediterranean diet. So there have been reports of reduced depressive symptoms in people who have self-reported. They had higher vegetable and legume consumption, and now they stopped showing that many symptoms. And for people who are diagnosed with depression, the Mediterranean diet actually did better than a social support group. Also, for the Western diet, they had less zinc, vitamin B12, vitamin B9, and all of that stuff was associated with ADHD, mild cognitive impairment, which is small problems with memory, thinking, and language, and depressive symptoms. So a bad gut is bad brain and bad memory. All right, here's a little summary on how a change in diet can help your mental health. So altering one's diet can lead to a change in their mental health due to the interaction between the gut and the brain and the gut's connection to neurological disorders. In the future, some future questions are, could there be a way to make medications related to dietary molecules that can help with gut health? So we know about these vitamin B12 pills and stuff like that. Can that directly influence the gut and then influence any depressive symptoms we may be having? And building on top of that, can these medications help with mental illnesses? Furthermore, is it possible to introduce different diets other than hospital food, which is known to be bad? And can we introduce these diets to people who have mental illnesses in hospitals and psychiatric wards? And can that actually help them? These are some things that we can further research about the gut-brain axis. That is the end. Thank you guys so much. And I would like to acknowledge my beautiful mentors, Dr. Deobrat Dikshit and Dr. Anupama Singh, and I'm so grateful for them for helping me through all of this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Anya. That was great. I think we have Aviraj next.
Yep. So let's get started. My name is Aviraj Dastidar. I'm from Claremont High School, the class of 2025, and my project is about a mathematical approach to optimizing autonomous control of UAVs in inclement weather. So a bit of context as to why this is even relevant. So when disaster relief operations take place, a major negative factor in these operations is suboptimal weather, because when pilots are flying disaster relief operations in said weather, it leads to an increased rate of human error, which leads to a less efficient disaster response time and more lives lost. However, we can use autonomous systems to alleviate this burden. So the goals of this project are multifold. The first is to study human reactions to different types of weather. The second is to create a utility function so we can quantify different types of weather and their severity, because we can't do anything with the types of weather just because we know that, oh, wind is bad, but how bad is the wind? We need to know exactly how bad it is for this third part, which is building a framework to determine where and when we should make the transfer between human and autonomous control. So a bit of background. So we're assuming that in these operations, UAVs are going to be used. They've been used in the past for disaster relief operations, two notable examples being the 2015 Gorka earthquake and surveillance following Typhoon Haiyan in 2013. However, they've been around for much longer than this, first being used for target practice in the Second World War and rising to prominence in the War on Terror for their reconnaissance abilities, which are shortly later recognized for value in disaster relief operations. Another major component of this is autopilot, because we're going to need to transfer from human to autonomous control to succeed in inclement weather operations. Now, autopilot's not a new technology, contrary to popular opinion. It can be traced back all the way to the 1930s, but because of the limits of the analog systems, it only rises to prominence in the 1980s. Now, the reason autopilot has such a big benefit to pilots is for several reasons. First, it simplifies decision making, meaning that pilots don't have to bear the burden of making complex decisions. It can lower fatigue as the autopilot can take over many menial tasks that pilots once had to do, and overall can streamline operations, which makes for a more efficient disaster response. So now we need to set up this experiment, right? We need to quantify the difficulty in flying different types of weather, and we can then use this in our framework to determine how best to optimize the switch between human and autonomous control. So in order to set up this experiment, we need to make several assumptions. The first is we want to assume that the swap between human control and autonomous control is automatic. The reason we're doing this is because we want to make sure that a human cannot reject the transfer of autonomous control, as this would severely damage our ability to collect data. The next thing we're going to do is we're going to assume that a landing challenge will be difficult to simulate the difficulties of flying in these weather conditions. The reason for this is we're going to have the pilots landing in different types of conditions. Now, that doesn't simulate an actual operational sortie, but it should be difficult enough to the point where we can actively garner and gather the information as to how difficult it is to fly in different types of weather conditions. And finally, we're going to assume that amateurs are flying the aircraft in these instances. This is because in case studies, we found oftentimes that disaster relief operations were being flown by amateurs simply because professionals were not available at the time. So now comes our utility function. So basically what this does is it allows us to quantify weather. And what we're going to do is we're going to break off the weather into 3 separate categories, measure the severity of each category, and put it together into this function. And using this function, we'll then be able to determine whether it's safe for pilots to fly or whether we should return to autonomous control. So the 3 components are wind, precipitation, and visibility. You can see here the scales. Wind is going to go from 0 to 40 knots, visibility 100% or perfect visibility to 0% or almost horrendous visibility. You can't see anything in front of you. Precipitation goes from 0 inches per hour, no precipitation at all, to 2 inches per hour, which is extreme precipitation. And now we have to score our pilots. Now this is important because it's very complex and difficult to quantify an inherently qualitative thing such as a landing, because a landing success, the success of a landing is not inherently determined by any one factor. However, we were able to quantify the success that pilots had in landing their aircraft using 4 different criteria. The first was glide slope. When you're landing an aircraft, you don't want to come in too high or too low. You want to come in just right. That's what glide slope is. The next thing you want to do is have a good approach. Again, when you're landing, you don't want to be too far to the left or too far to the right. If you're straight down the middle, you're going to get the point for glide slope. The third thing is approach. When you approach the third thing is flare. When the aircraft lands, you're going to flare. This will help the aircraft alleviate the burden of contact with the runway when it first lands. If the pilot does this successfully, that's another point. The fourth point is center line. Basically, once a pilot is on the runway, we want them to stay on the runway. We don't want them swerving off. So if they can manage to do this, that's the fourth point. If the pilot got 4 out of 4 points, meaning they met the requirements for all criteria, then that would mean the operation was a success. Meeting no criteria meant that the operation was a failure, and somewhere in between would be a moderate success or a moderate failure, depending on how many criteria they got right. Now, we carried out the experiment and we came to several conclusions. The first being that wind was one of the most pressing issues that pilots appeared to face. You can see here on the graph that at 35 knots, pilots were unable to succeed in meeting any of the criteria for a successful landing. But at low and medium wind speeds, we found that pilots were actually doing comparatively well handling the wind, implying that 1, we should define wind as an exponential curve, and 2, that the highest wind would have the most significant impact on pilot performance. The second issue was precipitation, which was interesting because though precipitation itself doesn't cause issue to pilots, conditions that come up alongside precipitation, such as hail and turbulence, can cause significant difficulties for pilots operating in such conditions. Because of this, when you had low or medium levels of rain, it had almost no effect on pilot performance. But when you moved up to the highest levels of precipitation, what we found was that because all these other factors like hail and turbulence were starting to come into play, there was a lot more impact on pilot performance, and as a result, many fewer criteria were met at these highest levels. So what we found was that until extreme precipitation is approached, pilots generally didn't see a significant drop in performance. Now, third criteria is perhaps the most interesting, and it's visibility. Visibility appears to play almost no major role in operations. Now, this is because pilots mostly were able to, at least to some degree, understand their location in reference to the runway, so they were able to make that landing successful anyway. And as a result, we only saw a slight drop in performance between the highest levels of visibility and the lowest levels of visibility. Now, due to an error in the line of best fit, you can see here that the graph is starting at 0.5 success rate for almost no visibility, and it's ending at a perfect success rate for perfect visibility. We had to model our utility function differently to account for this, which we'll see in the next slide. So now we have to combine all the factors, right? In reality, we're not going to see pilots just dealing with only strong wind or only strong rain or only poor visibility. Generally, what we're going to see is that all these factors are going to combine into one. Now, when pilots are forced to deal with multiple factors all at once, performance goes down significantly. So for example, in medium wind or medium precipitation, pilots were generally able to handle that pretty well. They were able to score 3 out of 4 or 4 out of 4 points on the criteria. However, when you had medium precipitation and medium rain and medium visibility, pilots had to deal with all 3 things at once, which caused an overload in stimuli, and as a result, performance cratered horrendously. You can see almost a 0.75 rate of failure, percentage of failure on the graph for medium rates of severity for all conditions. And of course, once you took all conditions to the maximum possible limit, pilots could not meet a single one of the criteria. So now we have to incorporate the AI now that we've found this. And based on the data we've collected, we can mathematically quantify different weather conditions affecting pilot performance. So you can see at the bottom here, this utility function where we decide a grade for precipitation, a grade for obscurity or visibility, and a grade for wind. We subtract 45 from this because of the utility function regarding visibility, where if we go back here, you can see the abnormally high y-intercept, and as a result, we subtract 45 to account for this. Now, basically what this utility function is telling us is that if all the factors combined have a severity greater than 100, then what we're going to do is we're going to switch to AI control, which is going to optimize our ability to recognize that humans are no longer capable of flying in these conditions, and we can simply transfer to AI control for safety. Now, what this does is it allows us to now have a stable framework for transfer of control between human and AI. You can see here that once in-flight operations begin, the aircraft begins to collect weather data as well as weather data from the ground. And now we can plug it into your utility function. And the utility function then tells us whether we should stay in human control or go to AI control. Now, what we can do again is we plug this equation again, although we account for the AI's increased ability to cope with poor weather. And we see, okay, is the AI still able to fly, or should we just return to base in order to save the aircraft? So using this framework, we now have an ability to recognize not only poor weather, but also a way to grasp with it, cope with it, and adapt, which in these disaster relief scenarios that we were originally talking about is going to lead to increased efficiency in disaster response times, which will in turn lead to lives saved in such scenarios.
Great. Thank you so much for that. I think we'll move on to Abhinav.
Hello. One moment. All right. I should share my screen. What screen is currently being shared?
I don't see it quite yet. Let's see. You try sharing screen one more time.
Sure. Go to.
Don't see your slides. Does anyone else? Oh, well, can you leave it up there? Maybe it's just taking a second to load.
It might be.
So can you share the
Oh
slides?
yeah, sure, of course.
Is anyone else able to see the slides?
It says, I think it just says it's started screen sharing, but it hasn't shown yet.
Yeah,
Okay.
same things for me.
Interesting. I'm not quite sure why.
Are you sharing the screen or your whole window? All right.
Is this working? Okay. So are the slides up?
Yep.
Okay, wonderful. Thank you. Sorry about that. I've had to navigate some technical difficulties today. Okay. So yes, as the title slide suggests, my project is about exploring the links between quantum entanglement and curved space-time. This is a topic that has enamored me in the past, and I've been very excited to pursue it in this research environment. So yes, that's what the project title is, and that's what I'll be going into today. Now, just as a general preface, this project makes heavy reference to higher level mathematical physics, including but not limited to tensor calculus, the covariant derivative, and connection coefficients, which are all just the mathematical terms that are included in the paper itself. So the following table is included and serves as a mathematical glossary, so to speak, for the aforementioned terms. However, the complete mathematics is not required to understand a general understanding of the concepts, and it's absolutely not required to understand the presentation at hand. So that's just a disclaimer, if you will. Now, onto ER equals EPR, wormholes equal entanglement. Now, just take a step back. The black hole information paradox is an issue that's been on the hotbed of modern theoretical physics. It essentially questions the location of information in a black hole after it's evaporated. So as black holes take in things, such as light, for example, planets, stars, etc., they in general are, we don't know where they go, right? But more recently, we've discovered that black holes evaporate. They eventually disappear. So the black hole information paradox basically questions what happens to the things it dissolves. It's been subject to a number of potential resolutions, arguably the most promising of which is ER equals EPR. Now, ER equals EPR is the term used by Dr. Leonard Susskind at Stanford and his colleagues to describe the theory that quantum entanglement and general relativity are intrinsically connected, so much so that the mathematical foundations describing two entangled black holes actually parallel those of wormhole mechanics and general relativity. The acronym ER equals EPR itself stands for the two papers, each written in 1935, whose theories it connects. The Einstein-Rosen paper presenting the foundations and the mathematical fundamentals for wormholes in general relativity, and the Einstein-Podolsky-Rosen paper presenting the theoretical backbone for the existence of quantum entanglement itself. Now, a lot of terms were just thrown out there, such as, of course, GR, general relativity, and ER, or quantum entanglement. So let's describe those. If I can click things. Yes, so quantum mechanics allows for non-local connectivity. Non-local essentially in this case means not directly connected. If I were to connect my hands like this, that's an example of local connectivity, most clearly because they are connected at the very basic level. Non-local connectivity essentially implies that these two things that are connected are not touching. There's no contact, there's no direct interface that connects these two things. So another example of non-local connectivity is, of course, the gravity, is, of course, ERBs, or Einstein-Rosen bridges, wormholes. And let's go into, in the next few slides, what quantum entanglement and what general relativity mean, because those terms are thrown out there, but let's kind of go into them. Now, quantum entanglement itself. Quantum entanglement, or the EPR part of ER equals EPR, is best described as the ability to know one property of a system by testing for that property on a different system. So if we can know something about one system simply by knowing that thing about the other, the two are said to be entangled. The magnitude of entanglement is measured in entanglement entropy, and the state of maximal entanglement is known as the singlet state. So in the graphic illustration that is on our right, we see measuring a pair of entangled photons. So while they are entangled and while we have not looked at them, they both have an equal probability of being either red or blue, as seen by the two dots being both red and blue. Now, if one is red, then we know without looking at two that two has to be blue, because we only have one red and one blue. So all it is all quantum entanglement boils down to is essentially using probabilities to know things about something without necessarily observing them. Now, it looks very intuitive on this scale because we're given two possible systems. So that's one red and then two blue. But of course, we know that as things increase in complexity and as there are more possible variables to consider, entanglement gets far more complicated. So this is a very basic example, but these two photons would be said to be maximally entangled, and they'd have a very low entanglement entropy. Now, on to general relativity. Einstein's theory of general relativity, which I will be referring to as GR, because general relativity is a mouthful, put simply, states that mass bends space-time. So in essence, it provided us with a very useful, albeit incredibly rigorous, mathematical tool for predicting and calculating the behavior of a curved spacetime on a cosmic scale. And the ERB, or Einstein-Rosen bridge, is a structure that connects two maximally distal or very, very far apart portions of spacetime. Now, you may be familiar with the ERB or wormhole from a lot of sci-fi, and just in general, pop culture has been known to throw around the terms such as wormhole or Einstein-Rosen bridge a lot, but there's very real mathematical implications of the wormhole, and it does, mathematically at least, theoretically exist. So that is general relativity. Now, the project itself, the ultimate goals of the project included, number one, to expand the current mathematical standard for describing black holes, which is known as the Schwarzschild metric, to include more possible scenarios, to describe the metric in terms that allow for the mathematical existence of wormholes, and finally, to present this topic in a format that's accessible to undergraduate and graduate students of the field of physics alike, because oftentimes all of the math that I have been referencing but not really showing serves to, in a lot of ways, detract from the actual conceptual meaning of a lot of the things that we're talking about, wormholes, etc. So having a place, a sort of repository for all of this information in an accessible format makes things a little bit clearer for someone who's interested in the field but not necessarily ready to dive headfirst into doing it all themselves. Now, in the general process of the paper, I started out with a description of quantum entanglement, which included a description of spin and entanglement entropy, which are just different properties of two different systems, and then a proof of Bell's inequality, which again works to prove the existence of quantum entanglement. Bell's inequality is just a mathematical tool, like a lot of these things. It's a theorem that really proves the existence of quantum entanglement. General relativity was step 2 of this process, and it started with a technical derivation of the Schwarzschild metric, which is a mathematical matrix that describes a system near a black hole. I then went into the coordinate transformations, leading to the KS, or Kruskal-Sekarej coordinate system, which basically gives the geometry of wormholes. Next was the connection through ADS-CFT holography, which is many words, and is covered more on slide 9. And then finally went into the implications on the connection to quantum teleportation and particle physics as a whole. So just going to the mathematical findings, we ended up with a mathematical description of wormholes in terms of the KS, or Kruskal-Sekarej coordinates. Now, with a number of mathematical tricks, we were able to compress the areas of the space-time diagram into the Penrose diagram pictured to the bottom right. So here are those. On the top, we see the Kruskal-Sekrej space-time diagram, which essentially shows all 4 sectors of space-time in one large scope. The Penrose diagram serves to convert all of that space-time into a more accessible format, as it is smaller and can be expressed on a finite piece of paper, essentially. So on this Penrose diagram down here, we're actually able to see the specific points of interest that we have in the system itself. So on sector 1 corresponds to the universe, right? And then drawing, again, connections from the top to the top diagram to the bottom one, we see section 1 is the universe. Section 2 is the black hole itself. Section 3 is the parallel universe, which is connected theoretically through this point at the center. My apologies, which is connected through this point at the center, which we know now is a wormhole. And then finally, section 4 would be the white hole, which is again another theoretical, just another theoretical concept. So the parallel universe and the universe themselves are connected through this point at the very center, which we know is a wormhole. And a lot of the paper basically served to prove the existence of that, and then take the existence of a wormhole itself and getting to this step over here allowed us to connect to ADS-CFT correspondence. So ADS-CFT was an incredibly influential paper that was published in the 1970s, 1980s. It essentially gave physicists a mathematical model or a tool for applying their theories in a space that had easier mathematics, because the current world as we know it has so many factors and so many different geometries to consider that taking a step back and looking at ADS, or this anti-de Sitter space, just allowed us to kind of apply our theories to a more general scope. So upon finding that mathematical solution that was showcased on the slide over here, we're able to search for the connection to quantum entanglement and finally get those pieces together in line for ER equals EPR. ADS-CFT itself is the theory that theories of gravity can be mathematically connected to theories of quantum mechanics with a specific correspondence. This diagram over here actually serves to illustrate that. Now, although, again, there are a number of more niche physics terminology on the slide, all that it essentially boils down to is an anti-de Sitter space, or a version of space-time that exists inside the boundary, and then, of course, a conformal boundary, so a boundary surrounding that space. You know, oftentimes we think of space and space-time as being this infinite expanse, but the universe itself and Einstein's field equations actually have proven to us that that is not the case. So in higher level theoretical physics, we began thinking about space-time as this finite construct, and then from there we can use mathematical tools to manipulate it. So yes, with ADS-CFT correspondence, it essentially states that inside that anti-de Sitter space, inside the cylinder itself, that area, that volume, we can test our field theory, or our theory of gravity, So in the ADS part of the diagram, we can test theories of gravity that might have implications or that might be interesting to us. And then on the outside of that theory, we can connect to quantum entanglement and we can connect to different versions of quantum field theories. So it just draws a correspondence between the two that is one of our most promising steps in the direction of actually getting a grand unified theory, or GUT, which physicists have long been, clamoring to try and find, because that essentially is a theory of everything. So this kind of serves as a step in that direction. And a lot of my project was built on describing and explaining these fundamentals in a more rigorous mathematical sense. And then from there, kind of applying my own original takes on what different solutions for different ADSs and different quantum field theories that could actually allow for a more deeper or more resounding connection between the two. And that is all. That was my project. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much. We'll hand it over to Jasmine now.
All right, okay, give me a minute. Oh, also, I think you, oh, okay, that's fine.
Sorry about that.
Yeah, you're good. Okay, can you guys see everything okay?
Yep.
Okay. So I'm Jasmine Wang, and I'm going to be presenting on the effects of various EDCs on the expression of cancer-related genes in rodents. So first, let's kind of discuss that long title. So to start, what are EDCs? So EDC stands for endocrine disrupting chemical, and what they do is pretty self-explanatory. They interrupt the normal functions of the endocrine system. So the endocrine system is made up of glands whose function is to produce the right amount of hormones, which are chemical messengers at the right time and in response to the right stimulus and in the right place. So different types of EDCs mess up this process in different ways, but most often we see this when they act as hormone mimics and bind to receptors that are meant to receive hormones rather than the actual hormones binding to those receptors themselves. So through this, EDCs have been known to cause metabolic disorders, diseases, and sometimes cancer. And additionally, examples of EDCs you may know are BPA, DDT, phthalates, and more. These are found in all kinds of products, from personal care products to plastic containers that store our food. And if you're in California, you've probably seen Proposition 65 labels that warn you about the presence of BPA in certain products. So kind of before I go into my cancer-related genes and all the things I'll be discussing, the initial methodology of this study was to kind of figure out like a cancer ranking of like self-assigned scores based on my data analysis, which are all relative, by the way. And it kind of came out as this way of testing my methodology that I came up with myself, but I'll discuss that a little bit more so that we all understand it. So I'm first wanting to discuss the kind of genes I decided to study. So I decided to study cancer-related genes. And there are many different types of cancer-related genes, but I chose to work with oncogenes, tumor suppressors, and metastatic genes. And these genes were all chosen based on availability of genes since I used public data sets for this analysis. So oncogenes are mutated proto-oncogenes, which are meant to suppress cancer. So a higher oncogene expression would theoretically add to my cancer score. Tumor suppressors, on the other hand, if highly expressed, would lower the theoretical cancer score. And lastly, I included cell adhesion related genes because not only do they help prevent oncogenesis, because they're related, because the unregulated adhesion can contribute to tumors, but they are also involved in the spread of cancer, which is called metastasis. They can vary in how they would affect the theoretical cancer score. And something to keep in mind is that some genes may be different types of cancer-related genes in different types of tissues, but I've accounted for that in the table I'm about to show you next. So this is a table of the genes I analyzed in my research. And as you may notice, basically all of the tumor suppressors are generally downregulated in cancer. And we see a lot of gastric carcinoma, colorectal cancer, and lung cancer there. And it makes sense because the kind of tissue I was using was liver tissue and pancreatic islets. Additionally, basically all of these oncogenes are upregulated in cancer, and we have some metastatic genes over here that are also upregulated. And so moving on to another methodology slide, I found my data sets from the NCBI gene expression omnibus database, and I calculated each chemical's cancer score by summing the log fold change of the top 5 expressed cancer-related genes. And if you didn't know, log fold change is basically this ratio that tells us the level of change in expression and whether it increased or decreased. For example, we would say that a gene is upregulated, I don't know, like any number n-fold, or in everyday language, we would say something like a number increased by 10-fold, if that makes sense. Something to add is that the cancer-related genes were filtered through manually. So I had to go in and search for metastatic genes and oncogenes and proto-oncogenes, everything like that. Okay, wait. Hold on, I think I lost a window. Okay, so the chemicals I decided to work with were bisphenol A, found in plastic food containers, tributyl tin oxide, which is found in biocides, benzoate-pyrene, which is found in car exhaust, charcoal smoked food, and more. And finally, acetylaminofluorine, which is used in labs to induce cancer. Not all of these were found in the same data set. So the first three chemicals were studied in the liver cells I mentioned, while BPA was studied in pancreatic islets. And so based on the background information on the chemicals and their uses, I hypothesized that the chemical with the highest relative cancer score would be acetylaminofluorine, which is the one used for labs to induce cancer. So now I'm going to be moving on to results. And so evident on the graph, acetylaminofluorine did indeed have the highest score of 6.18, while tributyl tin oxide had the lowest score of negative 5.034. And tributyl tin oxide and bisphenol A, as you can see, do have negative cancer scores, but the interpretation of this does not necessarily mean that they are preventative for cancer. And because these cancer scores are relative, a more accurate interpretation would be that they do not promote cancer as strongly as the other EDCs, at least in the genes investigated. So in conclusion, these results are indicative that murine or rodent cells respond to EDCs in such a way that promotes cancer in the absence of sex hormone signaling, as liver and pancreatic cells do not respond to steroid sex hormones like estrogen. Further research is needed to define EDCs and their specific roles in humans, despite many of the genes of interest having human orthologs. My hypothesis that acetylaminofluorine would yield the highest cancer score was correct, which builds some kind of credibility towards the validity of methodology that I used. And so I'm going to be talking about the limitations and next steps. And so this was a remotely conducted analysis. I did not have a lab. So I was using publicly available data rather than empirical data. So I was not really able to control the precise conditions of the experiment from which I drew data. Initial methodology was to create a matrix for fold changes of each gene and each chemical to best draw conclusions from patterns between them, but dataset availability limited the numbers of chemicals and genes and which ones. So genes also had to be manually identified as oncogenes, et cetera, which I mentioned earlier, which can cause some other cancer-related genes to be left out. Additionally, many genes can either be classified as oncogenes or tumor suppressors based on the type of cancer, and this study did not really focus on a single type of cancer. Instead, I attempted to analyze broadly oncogenic genes that function in the majority of cancer types. In future studies, focusing on a specific type of cancer may yield more accurate results, as gene role and expression can vary across cancer types. And a good candidate to examine with the same combination of genes used in this study would be colon or colorectal cancer. And also because the analysis was based on relative values, this method can only be applied to comparison of substances. It should not be used to identify carcinogens because our analysis was more targeted rather than unbiased. Furthermore, the relationship between gene expression, fold changes, and their ability to affect carcinogenicity was assumed to be additive, only because precise relationships between oncogenes and kind of each of their weighings are beyond the scope of this study. Thank you for your time.
That was great. Thank you, Jasmine. Everyone is working on such interesting work topics. Do we have questions from the audience so far? Why don't I get started? So I'm curious, we got to hear about topics from neuroscience, cancer, AI, and to some theoretical physics to a certain degree. I'd be curious to learn what drew each of you to the area of research that you guys worked on with polygens this summer? Jasmine, do you want to kick it off?
Yeah, actually, this was inspired by kind of this project I did at a summer camp back in 10th grade. It was online, so I didn't get to work in a lab either, but it was about analyzing gene expression in fruit flies instead, and kind of also investigating sexual dimorphism. And it really introduced me to kind of bioinformatics, data analysis in the context of biology, and epigenetics, which was just really interesting to me. So yeah.
Yeah. No, I mean, bioinformatics is very popular right now, and I'm curious to see how your career will develop if you're going to integrate these different bioinformatics approaches, right? From genomics to transcriptomics and epigenomics. I think there's just a treasure trove of information out there that very bright young scientists like you will get to uncover. Abhinav, do you have a second to share kind of what drew you to your research project?
Of course. Sorry, am I audible? Yeah. Yes, of course. I think that I've really always been interested in theoretical physics per se. I think I mean, behind me are just some massive whiteboards. I do a lot of theoretical physics because I think I've just been passionate about physics itself for maybe 5-6 years. And I really started delving into the mathematics behind it and the underpinnings probably 2 years ago. As far as a specific motivation goes, I wouldn't say that the project was based off of a theory I had in mind per se, but one of my inspirations, one of the ways that I really started studying and self-studying physics was with Dr. Leonard Susskind's continuing education lectures, which are all publicly available on YouTube, and Stanford's made them all, people can see them and do with them what they please. And the fact that that education was so available and just so present online at such a high degree too, really kicked off my passion for delving further into it and trying to see how far I could go, because so much is just there. And with the internet and everything, it's just, I was kind of taken aback by the level and the specifics of things that one can do if they're just interested and nothing else. Because I mean, a lot of the things covered, I don't know, just a lot of the things I covered in my project weren't really based on school per se, so much as, external products. And the fact that they're so readily available allowed me to kind of take hold of that. I mean, Dr. Susskind was such an influential part of my education in physics or in higher level physics that using one of his hypotheses and kind of basing my work off of one of his theories was really impactful for me. I think that was a big part of it.
Yeah, thank you. Aviraj?
Yep. So I just wanted to start by, I forgot to do this at the end of my presentation, but I just wanted to thank everyone for coming. And I especially wanted to thank my mentor, Annika Thomas, for guiding me through the process of everything. But yeah, next steps. That's actually difficult. I would probably expand the sample size, because for our project, we had a really small sample size for testing the different reactions to different types of weather. And I feel like that sample size kind of altered our statistics adversely. So maybe something I do is recreate this with a different sample size. Alternatively, I'm learning a bit of coding right now. So one thing I'd like to do is, if I get a bit more advanced, I'd like to actually try to create a simulation for this transfer to work in practice, just so we can see how it works out. One thing, the reason that I got interested in aerospace and aviation, I've actually been interested in airplanes for a long time. The concept of a gigantic chunk of metal that weighs almost 20 tons and has no business being in the sky, but still is there, has always fascinated me. So I definitely was set on doing something related to aviation. And I also didn't have too many resources to go out and actually build something or engineer something. So I decided I want to do something with sort of mathematical approach, so that I could still make an impact in aviation, but do it at the same time without actually having to build anything.
Right. Yeah. And there's a lot of, mathematically inspired design studies coming out now, right? So I think the work you're doing is super inspirational in that respect, where we can make mathematical models to inform design of, as you very eloquently said, these huge chunks of metal that have no business being in the sky. So I'm excited to see what you work on next. Anya, as a fellow neuroscientist, do you want to share what got you into neuroscience and potentially where you're seeing your research going next?
Yeah, and I'm sorry it's loud. There's like a lawnmower outside. But basically, I've been interested ever since I was a little kid. And it kind of stemmed from just like a love of, riddles and brain teasers. And then I started like taking psychology classes. And then I started taking neuroscience classes. And then just over the course of time, I started liking neuroscience. And then through Polygents, I was able to figure out kind of what I wanted to do more on the either the biotech side or maybe the nutrition side. It's very clear that I want to go into neuroscience. I'm so sorry about the noise anyway. I don't know if you can hear it really loud, but okay. But yeah, so I've just been interested ever since I was a little kid, and I just think this was a good experience to kind of hone in on what exactly I wanted to do. Like if I wanted to be a psych major, data science, cognitive science, neuroscience, and I think I'm pretty set now, which is great.
Love to hear that. We need more biomedical scientists. Or scientists of all types, really. We have a great question from Lucy about the research process. Would people be able to give us some insights into what was unique about this process? Was there something that surprised you about doing these literature reviews, testing your hypotheses, and so forth?
I can
Anya.
start. I'm already here. Yeah. So I think I've never done such a long project before research-wise. All the research papers that I've done is mainly through school, and that's a lot less of it's like a harder deadline, not much researching to actually do. So having to actually go through like multiple different databases, compile a lot of different reviews, read through them, find the right information, and kind of like summarize it into whatever I'm going to be writing. It was a very, very different process, and I think my mentors helped me a lot through that. I'm very, very grateful to them. And yeah, it was a great experience overall and very new to me for sure.
Yeah. Why don't we go in reverse order? Aviraj?
Yeah, one thing that was really surprising was just how much I was able to do, right? Because the expectation that you have coming into this program is like, how are you even going to be able to come up with like a professional level research project? Because you've never really done anything like this before. At least for me personally, I haven't done anything like this before. So it's really like interesting, like to see the development of just how much I could accomplish. So that was definitely one of the most surprising things that I found.
Yeah, no, you guys all did an exceptional job. It's impressive. These are projects that are not trivial by any stretch of the imagination, and the level of detail and the skillful and thoughtful execution of these projects is unbelievable. Thank you for that. Abhinav, do you want to give us some insights?
Sure. See, I think it's funny, the thing with theoretical physics in terms of a research paper really is that hypotheses and testing hypotheses requires either a quantum supercomputer that is capable of running, millions and millions of calculations, or simply modalities of executing more specific or niche innovations in such a way that you don't need to perform the insane amount of calculations that you would normally require. So with regards to, my research process, I really would say that I think learning and figuring out just how much information I could understand, I could learn in the stretch of time that it would require to not only learn these things and put them on a paper, but kind of create what I said, a sort of repository for understanding the information was interesting to me. And in that regard, I had to also, as well as learning the general content, the typical language, so to speak, of theoretical physics is often LaTeX, or the academic paper writing software, LaTeX/Overleaf, the way that physicists communicate with each other in terms of new discoveries, new publications. It's all through LaTeX and then putting their work on more specific sites and more specific journals. So it really was a process of kind of learning the culture of theoretical physics, learning how I would be working like this if I stuck through with it and pushed on towards getting my doctorate and eventually, going to be, a theoretical physicist. So I think that was what really made my research process different than expected, was just the amount of learning and the culture, the way that the community and the specific topic really played into what I had to do to understand my topic.
Yeah, it's a big shift. We can end with Jasmine.
Yeah, going into this, I knew exactly like the topic I wanted to investigate. It's just like getting from there to being able to find results without the use of a lab was really challenging for me, because everything I had previously known about, I guess, researching in biology had always been lab-based and very hands-on. And I've never been great with like data analysis and numbers. But it was like a really good like experience for me to explore something I never thought I would be able to do. And what was surprising was that like basically the magnitude of what I was able to do without any hand-holding independently, it made me feel a little bit more hopeful about my future in research and like even beyond that. So
Yeah, no, I mean, as someone that does bioinformatics, I'll say what you did was nothing short of exceptional. Your analyses were very thoughtful and I think very technically sound. And to be able to do that at this early career stage is incredible. Yeah, I'm very optimistic. We're out of time, but I'll end with this. Thank you to all of our great panelists today for sharing their work and all of their hard work this summer. You guys all have a very bright future in science if you choose to stay. And we, of course, would, as a society, benefit from having the best and brightest minds like yourselves continue in research. So thank you for sharing all your hard work with us and giving such thoughtful answers to some of the questions we had for you.
Thank you for the opportunity.
thank you for helping out, and thank you all for coming.
Of course, thank you everyone for attending and your questions. All right, take care.